Good morning to all of those of you who are in Australia. Buenas tardes, boas tardes for those in Latin America. My name's Noel Campbell. I'm the director of the Australian National Centre for Latin American Studies, ANCLAS, here at the Australian National University. Together with the university's First Nations portfolio, many thanks for joining us today. I'd also like to recognise the collaboration of the Latin American Students Association, which has included today's events as part of its first Latin America Week here at the university. But this is actually the fourth in a series of discussions to consider the approaches of Australia on the one hand and Latin American countries with significant Indigenous populations on the other, to enshrine an Indigenous voice in the political processes of their respective countries. Let me first begin by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose lands the university operates, and to pay our respects to the elders of the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people, past, present, and emergent, whose ancestors have protected and nurtured these lands for tens of thousands of years. There's less than a month before the referendum in Australia on whether or not to recognise First Nations Australians in the Constitution through an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament. With this in mind, the format of today's program is twofold. First, some introductory remarks by our two keynote speakers, Peter Yu, the Vice President of the ANU First Nations portfolio, who will review the background to the referendum and take stock of the current status of the campaign, and Yuri Montilla, a professor of law at Liberty University in the United States, who will share the experience of Bolivia in reforming its constitution, which is arguably the most progressive in Latin America in terms of protection and promotion of Indigenous rights. After the two presentations, Peter and Yuri will be joined by Manuela Fernandez de Cordova, the Chargé d'Affaires of the Embassy of Ecuador, in a panel discussion, which will be an opportunity for the panelists to compare and contrast the approaches of Australia and Latin America, particularly Bolivia, to address Indigenous recognition and rights. But before passing the floor to Peter, let me try and give the subject a little bit of context. I think it's only fair to ask, what has the upcoming referendum in Australia got to do with Latin America? Why Latin America? Let me tell you why. The United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, estimates there are over 45 million Indigenous people in Latin America. They represent over 50 different ethnic and linguistic groups and comprise some 8.3% of the total population. In many cases, countries with significant Indigenous populations have already reviewed and updated their constitutions to reflect and recognise Indigenous rights. By any measure, then, Latin America is a region which offers a wealth of experience, positive and negative, for academics and policymakers in Australia to discuss, to compare, to contrast, and to evaluate those experiences. In the first session of this series, we heard from the former Foreign Minister of Ecuador, Nina Pacari, herself a Quechua woman, how constitutional reform in that country in 2008 resulted in a fundamental shift in the political paradigm from a centralised unitary state to a plurinational state, a state that expressly recognises and protects Indigenous communities and peoples and nations. The second session considered the case of Chile, where 13% of the population identify as Indigenous. Yet, in common with Australia, they played no part in the formation of the Chilean state. In 2022, a constitutional convention agreed on a new constitution for Chile, which included several articles recognising and protecting Indigenous rights. It was put to a referendum in September of last year, but failed, not exclusively because of the provisions on Indigenous rights, although in hindsight, they certainly raised concerns that they were too ambitious, that they were too detailed, and that they were insufficiently explained to the public. The third session heard from Brazilian experts, in common with its regional neighbours and obviously with Australia too, the colonial legacy in Brazil was mostly negative, although exceptionally, the Portuguese administration accepted a concept called indigenata, by which it recognised the pre-existence of indigenous sovereignty over ancestral lands. The most recent breakthrough for indigenous peoples in Brazil was the adoption of a new constitution in 1988, which guaranteed indigenous rights, including recognition of indigenous organisations and customs and languages, land rights, the right to be consulted on certain issues directly affecting them. But the record of successive governments in implementing those rights has been mixed. But there's hope that with the change of government in Brazil in January of this year, that there'll be progress in the future. But today we're going to consider the evolution of indigenous rights in Bolivia. Bolivia is unique because it's the country in Latin America with proportionally the largest indigenous population. Yet ever since the arrival of the Spanish conquistadores in the 16th century, it's had a history of chronic political instability, social inequality, and ethnic divisions. Fast forward to 2005, when Evo Morales, an indigenous leader and coca farmer, was elected as Bolivia's first indigenous president. His presidency marked a shift towards progressive policies and greater inclusion of indigenous and marginalized groups. In 2006, he convened a constituent assembly which was mandated to write a more inclusive and pluralistic constitution that recognized Bolivia's multicultural character. The new draft was enshrined significant indigenous rights, including recognition of the indigenous legal systems, greater political representation, and land rights. It declared Bolivia to be a plurinational state. The draft was put to a referendum in 2009 and was approved by almost 2/3 of the vote. 14 years later, I think it's fair to ask, what has been the record of Bolivia on indigenous rights? How effective has the process been for determining land rights? Have indigenous peoples been adequately consulted on issues affecting them and their lands? Has there been progress in reducing the gap between indigenous and non-indigenous Bolivians? And are indigenous peoples adequately represented in Congress? These are the sorts of questions I hope that we'll be able to explore during the discussion today. But before we turn to the panel discussion itself, let me give the floor to Professor Peter Yu, the inaugural Vice President of the First Nations portfolio here at the Australian National University. Peter is a Yawuru man from Broome in the Kimberley region in the northwest of Australia, with over 4 decades of experience in Indigenous development and advocacy. More recently, he's drawn on those advocacy skills as a member of the Referendum Working Group and the Referendum Engagement Group. So Peter, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Noel, and thank you all for coming today to be part of this, series of discussions in regards to matters that we might have in common as First Peoples. And I think you asked the question, what does it have to do with Latin America? And it's just, we'll first of all do a slight history similar to Noel and just explain some of the context, the background, and then I will come to the question of the moment, of course, which is the forthcoming referendum on October 14th in relation to a voice to Parliament, to government. So what do we have in common? I think most people will, I just want to check this work. Okay. Most people, what we have in common basically is the Vatican edicts of the 14th century in relation to the doctrine of discovery issued by Pope Nicholas V, sorry. Paul's a familiar name, but it's Nicholas actually, got to blame the right one. The question and the subsequent history of that in respect to its impact. So every story has to have a beginning. And for Indigenous peoples, other than where we came from and from our creative beings, the nature of our engagement historically and contemporarily, of course, is from this very defining moment with the doctrine of discovery. And largely, the edicts were permitted to Spain and Portugal to establish slavery trading posts on the West African coast. And so under the premise, on the basis of, as you can see on the slide, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans and reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. And so that was the doctrine which underpinned the supposed, inverted commas, legality of occupation and conquest by Europe. And you may be also familiar that in March this year, that Pope Francis repudiated the doctrine of discovery, saying that the Catholic Church therefore repudiates these concepts that fail to recognize the inherent human rights of Indigenous peoples, including what has become known as the legal and political doctrine of discovery. So that's what we have in common, very much in common. The subsequent history of that also has a lot of commonality. Here in Australia, of course, the concept of terra nullius, that this was an empty land, no one was here when the British came here. And of course, the legal determinations in the court at that time links terra nullius to the doctrine of discovery. When Lieutenant, as it was then, James Cook in 1770, even though he was issued with instructions from King George III to take possessions of the great southern lands with the consent of the natives, no consent was sought or given. And it took 222 years to 1992 in Australia, where the Australian High Court in the Mabo case struck down terra nullius as a repugnant notion and a legal myth, and recognised that native title had always been in existence and had not been extinguished. And in Australia, subsequent to that, negotiations saw in 93, 94, the establishment of the Native Title Act, allowing a process in regards to First Nations communities being able to lay claims to their native title interests in the land. The High Court said that the Aborigines were dispossessed of their land parcel by parcel to make way for expanding colonial settlement. Their dispossession underwrote the development of the nation. And again, in 1996, there was another High Court decision in relation to the coexistence of native title on the mainland of large pastoral stations, pastoral leases. I think you perhaps might refer to them as ranches in Latin America. And that the native title could coexist, could sit alongside the pastoral leases. And as a consequence today, more than half, 60 plus 70% of the land assets in Australia have a direct or indirect interest from the traditional owners of the land, First Nation communities. And part of that now today is the ability for First Nation communities having the right to negotiate any third-party interest in any activities or interest on their lands, whether that be for resource development, whether that be for tourism, whether that be other forms of development, whatever it might be, there is a right to negotiate on those provisions. But as part of the deal done in 1992, 93, 94, was that all of the previous acts prior to 1975, because Australia, the 1975 is a line in the sand and a cutoff point because of the 1975 Racial Discrimination Act. Hence lands prior to that, activities and acts prior to that were validated by the Aboriginal negotiation team. So any future acts, that is after 1975, were subject to the right to negotiate. In the 1968 Boyer lectures, an eminent Professor William Stanner from the ANU coined the term the Great Australian Silence to describe the hidden history of genocide, violent dispossession, exploitation, and systemic and systematic discrimination. And you can find information on this documentation and the frontier violence by looking at the IATSIS have done a map of the massacre sites around Australia. Rachel Perkins, a very famous First Nations filmmaker, her TV series from the Frontier Wars on SBS. You can find that on SBS Demands. My early work working with communities where I come from, I visited many massacre sites by very senior people who still held the stories and have passed down. In fact, in late 1970s, I was working with in a very remote area with some very senior old people who had been left basically in a camp without much resources. And there was one of the old men was isolated from the rest of the community, and I was told the story that he was a police boy. He had accompanied the police up the Forest River in 1927, where there was a massacre of Aboriginal people on the basis that the massacre took place because an Aboriginal man had killed a white settler for taking his wife, and therefore the Aboriginal man had retaliated, and the police then sent out a party to basically massacre, kill and burn members of that community as a result of that retaliation. And so in my lifetime, I was able to see and talk to survivors of a massacre, or at least people who were partaking with that massacre, with that act. So, and I was shown numerous places when I worked in very remote areas by people showing me skeletal remains scattered on the ground, multiple skeletal remains where people had been massacred in the bush. So recent comments, and there've been in the debate currently on The Voice, there is an attempt to what we call a white blindfold view of history, to not address the kind of reality of the truth of the matter and the nature of the revisionist nature of those propagating that aspect of the history, to the extent that some comments that colonialism did not have a negative impact on First Nations peoples. So that shows you the continuing pervasive ignorance that exists in Australia. Unfortunately, that also came from a First Nations person. So the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which is where I will lead on to in regards to The Voice, particularly of where the proposition in regards to the proposed amendments have arisen, calls for a national truth-telling process to address this very ignorance. But what I might do is to take you very quickly through the milestones, because as Noel has pointed out in the history of Bolivia, there are certain milestones. Certainly in Australia, we haven't stood still in a lot of ways. I mean, the cause for Aboriginal advocacy and activism in relation to recognition of the rights has been there ever since settlement, since the first British settlers and colonisers set foot in Australia. But important in terms of the legal history of Australia, it's probably 1967, because the referendum never recognised Aboriginal people. We were not included in the referendum through the constitutional conventions in 1897, and then, of course, the 1901 constitution. Of course, the Australian constitution is a British Act of Parliament, which we have on permanent loan from the House of Lords here in Australia. And the first Act of Parliament, of course, in Australia is a racist piece of legal doctrine, based largely driven by fear of the Chinese and other Asian people on the Australian goldfields at the turn of the last century, and for fear, and also for fear that they would have a major influence in relation to the nature of their contribution to the voting in elections. And so, but it was driven because the state governments, Australians reluctantly became a federation because New South Wales and Victoria were under very strong patronage economically from England and did not want to share their wealth. So the then named father of federation, Henry Parkes, provided the opportunity through this Clause 25. Clause 25 of the Constitution says that the state governments in Australia can discount votes on the basis of race. And Aboriginal people were not included, of course. So part of the discussion you will hear today is that there is a view that the proposition of the voice is on racial grounds, but of course that's absolute nonsense because race power is already in the Constitution. But throughout history, the legal history, 67 referendum was when Aboriginal people were acknowledged in the national census for the first time, and therefore provided for the Commonwealth government to be able to make laws for Aboriginal people. Prior to that, it was only the state governments that made laws for controlling Aboriginal people in their particular states. And through there have been, the first act after 67 was the establishment of the Federal Department of Aboriginal Affairs as a direct manifest of that constitutional change. But there's another date that's not there, but it's the 1968 pastoral award wages. Before that, Aboriginal people were working as slave labourers on the vast pastoral leases. But in 1968, the Arbitration Commission deemed that there should be equal wages in the pastoral industry, and hence the majority of the Aboriginal population, if or not all, were basically kicked off, were chased off the pastoral leases, and the gates were locked. And so what we had in Australia was an internal refugee situation of about 1,000 to 2,000% overnight of people congregating on very small service towns around these pastoral industries. And hence, in my personal view, the nature of our current despair and disempowerment has been compounded by the nature of that decision. There was no planning, no question of engagement. There's no strategy to the execution. So it was completely left without any form of organisation around that. And then they had representative bodies, the National Aboriginal Consultative Committee in 1973 through 1978. In fact, that was initiated by the Conservative government, but then done away by the Labor government when they came into power in 1975, 74. And it was later called the National Aboriginal Conference. I was elected to the National Aboriginal Conference. I was the youngest member elected in Australia for my area in the West Kimberley of the area. So, and that was then done away with. Then we had the Northern Territory Land Rights Act. I'll go through this very quickly because I've taken a bit of time, but you can see for yourself the nature of the various kind of milestones, legal milestones that have happened. There has been various reports, of course, the Bringing Them Home report, the Stolen Generation, the history of Aboriginal people, similar to what's more globally known to what's happened in Canada with the residential schools and now also America. There's a greater exposure of similarly what happened. And historically, previously, of course, in Ireland, there were children taken off their parents, placed in Catholic missions and dormitories. In Australia, my mother was a member of the Stolen Generation. She was taken away when she was 10 years old from her family and put on a Catholic mission. So my background is I'm third generation Catholic mission. I was sent away to a mission school when I was 10 years old into the city. So my peers, I suppose, were formerly, but today, even today, there's still unacceptable numbers of Aboriginal children that are being displaced into various other forms of care, usually government care. There's also been recent discoveries, similar to the residential school in Canada and Australia, of unknown grave sites of young children and people that yet to be explained. And when you think about it, going back to my original statement about the nature of what is common amongst us, you see that there obviously was collusion between various colonial powers, particularly as far as the British is concerned, in Canada, in Australia, in South Africa, and also in New Zealand. The 1948 apartheid regime, for example, came from the various legislations here in Australia and also in Canada, the Canada Reservations Act, I think it was 38, 1905, then 38 Aboriginal Citizenship Act in Western Australia. So my mother, she was taken from her family, put into a Catholic dormitory to raise. When she grew up at working age, she worked for some white people, but she had to have a permit. We had to apply to become a permit in those days, and that was up until early 1970s, where to become an honorary citizen, basically to become an honorary white person, you were not allowed to speak your language, you're not allowed to associate with your people. My father, who's Chinese, was against the law for him to have a relationship with my mother. There was a surveillance of relationships between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people, be they white people or be they Asian people. There was surveillance, color-coded by the police. It was £30 at that stage as a penalty for cohabiting with a native. So I've grown up through this history, so I understand the nature of what happened at that particular time, even though I'm really at the kind of end of that particular time. So then we had the apology to the stolen generation in 2008, but of course, in all of these things where there has been some attempt to look at the reckoning of these historical events, none of this has involved reparation or compensation for the various historical acts on Aboriginal people. And here we have, of course, now we have the Voice to Parliament in 2017, was the commencement of the Referendum Council in 2015. And even though this has been going for more than 20 years, way back in 1995, I think the ATSIC Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission recommended greater investigation into the representation and advice to government. But the process that brings us to where we are at the moment really commenced in 2017, and then which was a number of regional dialogue sessions between Aboriginal people in the first instance, which culminated in a national convention at Ulara or Uluru, where the statement comes from. And fundamentally, the breakup of the representation, I think there was about 60%, 40%, sorry, of organisations, Aboriginal people working in organisations, and the other 50% of that that demographic was broken up into elders, senior elders, and also representation from youth and women particularly. So there was a broad cross-section of demographic that was involved in the consultation. That culminated in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, basically in 2017, where the only real ask or proposition put was an amendment to the referendum for creating of a voice to Parliament to be able to advise the government, the Parliament, and the executive. So it's an advisory body. I keep missing these slides, but anyway, in 2021, at the election of the Albanese government, the Prime Minister on the election night made a commitment to implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. And so we're now leading up to the last few weeks before the referendum happens on October 14th. The Voice is a modest proposal, but it has the potential to be quite transformational in changing the relationship between First Nations peoples and the Australian nation. The reconciliation process has been in place since the early 1990s, and it has not delivered what we have anticipated. And I think, given the nature of the very toxic debate at the moment, a very racist debate, I would say that Australia is a very long way to be able to arrive at that point of the destination. But very quickly, just to let you know, the Voice is about having a representative body to the federal parliament. This is what's being proposed in the constitutional amendments: a voice of Aboriginal people to represent in Parliament, to the government, and also to the executive of government, to be able to make representation, to establish the voice, to make representation on matters that are relevant and pertinent just to Aboriginal people issues. It has no mandate or remit in regards to any other matters that affect the broader Australian community. And of course, the nature of what its functions and powers will subject to the laws and the authority of the Parliament. So quite simply, it is an advisory body. It has no power of veto. It is not a third chamber of the Parliament. And the governments can continue to have the authority to be able to make laws that will affect the nature of the function of the powers. The question is asked, why does it need to be embedded in the Constitution? Well, of course, the recognition, the first part of the amendment is the recognition of Aboriginal people as the first peoples of Australia. So you would naturally imagine, by extension, the manifestation of what that actually means. The voice presents that opportunity as a functional capacity to give advice to government about matters pertaining to Aboriginal people. The other thing, of course, is the history I've shown you. We've had numerous advisory bodies over periods of times that have been unilaterally basically removed without the consent, without the acknowledgement. The embedding of the voice to Parliament ensures its security and longevity in relation to its ability to continue to provide that role. Aboriginal people still occupy the very lower rungs of the socio-economic disadvantage. We continue to have all of the unfortunate statistics in regards to our imprisonment rates, the highest incarceration rate of Indigenous peoples anywhere in the world, in Western Australia, anytime up to 42%. The high and recidivism levels as well. We have the highest youth suicide levels. We have the list goes on and on and on. And the government, in its current national policy framework of closing the gap, has not succeeded. The Prime Minister gets up every year to report on the various targets to parliaments that they are attempting to address in all of this area dealing with the social and economic and cultural and health and well-being of Aboriginal people. And every year, embarrassingly, the Prime Minister has to say that we have not closed the gap out of 20 targets. This has been going on for over a decade, and we've only met some of the targets, not 100%, but some of the way. So it's demonstrated that public policy, the history of public policy in Australia in the last 50 years has failed dismally, and largely it's because the decisions that are made from a policy and program point of view are made without the involvement nor the consent of First Nations peoples. I'll stop there.
Great, many thanks, Peter. I think that clearly your remarks have touched on parallels with developments in many Latin American countries. I think there were three particular points that I noted down whilst you were speaking that stood out to me. First of all, the discredited doctrines of discovery that you mentioned, dating from the two papal bills in the 14th century, asserting that countries like Australia and Bolivia were discovered by Europeans when in fact they'd been inhabited by Indigenous peoples for tens of thousands of years. Similarly, I guess the concept of terra nullius. Secondly, I think your comment about the absence of consent of Indigenous peoples upon occupation, by colonial occupation, I think that directly led to what you described as a struggle by Indigenous peoples, not only in Australia, but in Latin America and elsewhere, a struggle for recognition and rights that's been ongoing ever since. And thirdly, I think your reference to attempts, I think you referred to a reckoning, if you like, attempts to address systematic racism and denial of rights. You referred to milestones, and I think in many countries they can point to milestones. In our own case, as you said, the constitutional referendum back in 1967, the Uluru Statement is a milestone by any measure. And most recently and currently, of course, the proposition to amend the Constitution by establishing an Indigenous Voice to Parliament. But let me now switch to the case of Bolivia and invite Yuri Mantilla to give us a snapshot of the current status of Indigenous peoples in that country. Yuri is a professor of law at Liberty University in the United States. His research is focused mainly on international law and international trade law and human rights law. He's published widely, including on political and ethnic conflict in Bolivia. So, Yuri, vos tenés la palabra. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Noel. I am delighted to be here. Can you see my PowerPoint? I'm trying to share it.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So let me just begin this and okay, so show here from beginning. I would like to address the issue of indigenous people's rights and the Bolivian Constitution from the perspective of the 21st historical context in which we live. I believe the Bolivian Constitution, indigenous people's rights, is one of the most advanced in the world. And this is in part, obviously, due mainly to the struggle of indigenous communities for freedom, to systematic efforts against colonialism, neocolonialism, all forms of ethnic, racial discrimination. But also, I believe in the historical context in which we live, international law and international organizations are important to understand the issue of indigenous people's rights, considering the global recognition of the importance of protecting indigenous people's rights in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, on a number of international conventions, including the International Labor Organization conventions, in the Inter-American System of Human Rights, the American Convention regarding indigenous people's rights. So in that context, Bolivia is a very important case because Bolivia has the largest percentage of indigenous communities. So despite the fact of the systematic efforts of genocide, including cultural genocide, indigenous peoples in Bolivia were able to resist those efforts to destroy their cultures. And today, depending on different numbers, but indigenous people's rights, indigenous peoples in Bolivia are at least half of the population of Bolivia. So this great diversity of indigenous communities, as we can see in this slide, includes in different departments of Bolivia, indigenous peoples such as the Yampara, the Yuki, the Chiquitano, the Chichas, the Guarani, so many indigenous peoples, so many. Some scholars believe they may be 100 and more. Others believe that officially they are recognized more than 30, which is a very, very low number. So there is a great diversity of indigenous communities in Bolivia. So the history of indigenous people's rights goes back to the moment in which Francisco de Pizarro in the city of Cajamarca, in what is now Peru, started the conquest of the Inca Empire in 1532. Since that moment, since the moment of the illegal and unjust use of force against the Inca Empire, there has been a systematic effort to undermine indigenous communities and to take over their natural resources. One of the main reasons for the Spanish conquest was to exploit gold, silver. Today, the struggle of indigenous people's rights continues to be the protection of their territories and the exploitation of natural resources. In Bolivia, today, that natural resource is lithium, because Bolivia has the largest resources of lithium in the world. And so there are transnational companies that are trying to take part in the process of the exploitation of lithium in Bolivia today. And so as we look back to the history of the Inca Empire, to the struggle of indigenous communities, we can see how in Bolivia, indigenous communities have been very well organized. Indigenous movements, Tupac Katari, Bartolina Sisa, other historical movements in Bolivia, they were able to resist colonialism, neocolonialism, and they were fundamental actors in the struggle for democracy. They were the ones that led efforts against military dictatorships in Bolivia. So in essence, I would like to argue that Bolivia today has a democratic regime because of the struggle of indigenous communities. Remember, we are talking about at least half of the population or more of Bolivia are indigenous. And so in that context, indigenous people's rights needs to be analyzed on this broader struggle for democracy, for natural resources, and for ethnic equality. There were many efforts in Bolivia to take over natural resources, including the famous struggle for natural gas in 2003, where the government of Bolivia at that time in 2003 was in the process of signing an international agreement with a transnational company for the sale of natural gas. And the indigenous communities understood that this was not acceptable. They didn't want this to happen because they believed that all that money was not going to benefit the Bolivian people. So there was a very strong struggle against the takeover of natural resources in 2003, which was the beginning of violent protests, which led to a process in which finally in 2006, after a turmoil, after finally having national elections, Evo Morales becomes president of Bolivia in 2006, and he is considered one of the first or the first indigenous president of Bolivia. So natural gas and oil reserves were nationalized by Evo Morales' government in 2006, and then there is a constitutional assembly with 255 directly voted deputies that participated in this constitutional assembly to write a new constitution. And so this is the beginning, in essence, of the crisis of the uninational, monocultural, monolingual, neoliberal, neo-colonial state. So this is the moment in which indigenous communities said, we don't want to live in a country that does not recognize the pluricultural nature of our country. We don't want to live anymore in a racist country that disregards the majority of Bolivians. And so this constitutional assembly was extremely important. There was a lot of violence, racist movements that did not want indigenous peoples to have access to power. They resisted this constitutional assembly, and there was a lot of violence in the city of Sucre in 2007. But at the end of the day, the resolution of this conflict led to the Constitutional Assembly approving the text of this new constitution, which went obviously to Parliament, to Congress, and then in Congress there was a number of reviews of the text of the constitutional draft approved by the Constitutional Assembly, and after that this went to a national referendum. So this national referendum in Bolivia, 25th of January 2009, finally in that referendum, 61% of Bolivians approved this new constitution. And this is a historical moment for indigenous people's rights, because this is perhaps one of the most advanced constitution in the world for the protection of indigenous people's rights. So in this constitution, there is a very, very clear understanding of the interculturality of constitutional law principles. So interculturality is one of the main principles of the new constitution of 2009. So this, in a process, in a constitutional process to decolonize the law, decolonize the country, modify power relations between diverse groups, with the recognition of the importance of affirmative action of the state to achieve a real intercultural law, to achieve real interculturality. So constitutional law in Bolivia today, thanks to this new constitution, has fundamental principles of legal pluralism, interculturality. And because of that, there is a recognition in the constitution of diverse jurisdictions. There is the jurisdiction of the native indigenous communities, Indígena Originario Campesino jurisdiction. There is the ordinary constitutional jurisdiction, and there is the agro-environmental jurisdiction. Under the Constitution of Bolivia, all these jurisdictions are equal. So there is a great achievement for indigenous peoples that can now have this kind of jurisdiction at an equal level with others. So what makes this constitution so unique and different is that it's not only the recognition of diverse cultures, but is the recognition of diverse nations, the recognition of nations, the right to self-determination. Articles 2 and 30 of the Bolivian Constitution recognizes this. A great achievement, a very important achievement for indigenous communities. And then something that really highlights the political context, because law is a reflection, obviously, of political realities. It's written in the preamble to the Bolivian Constitution on 2009. And I would like to read this briefly because this is very important to understand Bolivia and Bolivian constitutional law. The preamble of the Bolivian Constitution says, "We, the Bolivian people of plural composition from the depths in history, inspired by the struggles of the past, by the anti-colonial indigenous uprising, and in independence by the popular struggles of liberation, by the indigenous social and labor marches, by the struggles of land and territory, construct a new state in memory of our martyrs." You see how important it is, that word, anti-colonial indigenous uprisings, like the ones by Tupac Katari and Bartolina Sisa, but also this word, construct. So this is just the beginning. This is relatively a new constitution. So although this constitution has wonderful norms, it's just the beginning of a construction of a new state. That's important to understand, that still this is just a legal narrative, which in reality, many of these issues is still, they need to be implemented. And then the other important aspect of this preamble is that the recognition of respect for the economic, social, juridical, political, and cultural pluralism of the inhabitants of Bolivia. Pluralism, again, and coexistence are very important legal concepts in Bolivia. So Bolivia is a unitary social state of plurinational communitarian law, and it has linguistic, cultural, juridical pluralism. In that context, in international law, as well as in the law of Bolivia, self-determination is one of the main principles in indigenous people's rights. And Article 2 recognizes the pre-colonial existence of nations, of indigenous peoples, and their ownership of their territories. And it recognizes that now indigenous peoples have the self-determination consistent of the right of autonomy, self-government, their cultural recognition of their institutions, and the consolidation of their territorial entities. So it is really a very strong statement in the Constitution of Bolivia for the recognition of the right to self-determination. Also, in Article 3, Bolivia recognizes all people, all Bolivians, right? Not only indigenous nations. It recognizes also the Afro-Bolivian communities, the Bolivian people, the native indigenous nations as well. It's a pluralistic state that recognizes all these nations. And another very interesting feature is the plurality of languages. It's not only Spanish that is the official language. It used to be Spanish, but now we have Aymara, Aroana, Besiro, so many other languages, the Quechua, that are part of the languages of Bolivia. So in that context, another interesting development in terms of indigenous people's rights in Bolivia is the recognition of fundamental ethical principles of indigenous worldview. Indigenous worldviews in the past, in other constitutions, were not recognized as part of the political structure of Bolivia, or the legal structure. But today, Article 8 recognizes ethical indigenous principles together with also European principles as part of the constitution. Amaquilla, Amaluya, Amasuya, Suma Kamana. Some of the principles, don't be lazy, don't steal, don't lie. Some of the principles of indigenous people's worldviews are recognized. So another thing in Bolivian constitutional law is the recognition of the diversity of religious worldviews, including Catholic, including Christian, but also indigenous worldviews. In the past, it used to be one official religion, Catholicism. Today, there is not. So today, the Bolivian constitution recognizes a diversity of worldviews, including indigenous peoples. And another interesting thing from the perspective of the theory of indigenous peoples' rights is that the Bolivian constitution in Article 30 has a very clear definition of indigenous people. As you know, for those that are international legal scholars, this is not always the case in international agreements. It's hard to have a definition of indigenous peoples. But here, the Article 30 says that regarding indigenous people, a nation and rural native indigenous people consists of every human collective that shares a cultural identity, language, historic tradition, institutions, territory, and worldview, whose existence predates the Spanish colonial invasion. So it's a very clear recognition that Bolivia is trying to build out a pluralistic state and trying to deconstruct the colonial state. Bolivia recognizes that there's still colonialism as an ideology, racist, still is part of the Bolivian society. So these effort to build a pluralistic society includes the recognition of Spanish colonialism, a Spanish invasion of indigenous territories. And so because of this, there's a recognition of a number of rights for indigenous peoples consistent with international law, consistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, other international treaties. Some of those are to be free, the right to their cultural identity, religious belief, to self-determination and territory, to the collective ownership of land and territories. Then others to the practice of their political, juridical, and economic systems in accordance to their own worldview. Another fundamental human right recognized in the Constitution. This is important because it deals with natural resources. Article 30:16, to participate in the benefits of the exploitation of natural resources in their territory, such as lithium. And so there is a number of rights recognized in the Bolivian Constitution. From that perspective, Bolivian constitutional law theory also highlights the importance of international law, international treaties. Article 410 says, the Constitution is the supreme norm of Bolivian law and enjoys supremacy before any other normative disposition. The components of constitutional law include the international treaties and conventions in the matter of human rights and the norms of communitarian law, which have been ratified by the country. So Bolivian constitutional legal scholars highlight the fact that there is a constitutionality block, that when Bolivian courts apply the law in the field of indigenous people's rights, they also have to consider the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Convention of the International Labor Organization number 169 regarding indigenous peoples. If any of these treaties have norms that are superior to Bolivian norms regarding indigenous people's rights, according to the constitutionality block theory in Bolivian constitutional law, those laws have to be applied. So there is a lot of influence of international law in Bolivian constitutional law. I am almost finalizing my presentation, so I would like to highlight the importance of legal pluralism, the importance of Article 178 of the Bolivian Constitution. The power to impart justice emanates from the Bolivian people, and it is based on the principles of independence, impartiality, juridical security, legal pluralism, which includes indigenous jurisdictions, being intercultural. So over and over, the worldview, the legal theory of the Bolivian Constitution is pluralism, the central recognition of indigenous people's rights. And because of that, indigenous jurisdictions in the law enjoy the same status as ordinary jurisdiction. And so that's a great achievement. In Bolivia, there are three main jurisdictions. And so ordinary jurisdiction, there is the agro-environmental jurisdiction for the protection of the environment. And then there is the rural native indigenous jurisdiction, which under Bolivian law, they are all equal. And so in that context, there has been obviously systematic efforts to ensure higher participation of indigenous peoples at all levels of government. And as I mentioned before, there are a diversity of indigenous communities in Bolivia. There are some, like the peoples of the lowlands, that are a small percentage of the population of Bolivia. And so for those peoples of lowlands, there are 7 seats in the Bolivian Plurinational Assembly that they get. So since the establishment of the new mechanism of reserve seats in 2009, 7 of the 130 seats in the national parliament have been secured for minority indigenous people. These are the minority indigenous people, not the majority people, indigenous peoples like the Aymaras and the Quechua. This is exclusively for these lowland indigenous communities. So because of that, there are seven places in parliament for them. However, when that's the Bolivian parliament, as you can see, the heavy influence of indigenous art, you can see in the background, the Tiahuanacu culture is there everywhere. You can see the Huipala flag, which is an indigenous symbol, is there, is very strong. And so, so for majority indigenous peoples, the Aymara, the Quechua, their power is exercised mainly through political parties, like the current political party in power, the MAS, M-A-S, has a very large social base of indigenous communities. And the vice president of Bolivia, Mr. David Choque Huanca, is of Aymara background. And there are a number of members of parliament, of Congress, of the Plurinational Bolivian Assembly that are indigenous because of this idea of a multi-ethnic party that enables them to participate in parliament. That's at the national level. Now, at the local level, at the regional level, there is direct access to indigenous people, secure access to indigenous communities. Like that's an example of the Department of La Paz, where indigenous communities, all of them have 5 members that they are appointed, right, into this departmental legislative organ. So that's a different system in which there is a more direct participation of indigenous peoples at the local level, at the regional level, unlike at the national level, which is a different system. So in that context, my last remarks will be to just highlight the fact that in the 21st century historical context, indigenous people's rights are a fundamental part of the international community in all nations, and that Bolivia is leading the way in its constitution. However, that's only a legal narrative. The implementation of those norms are extremely difficult. Bolivia still is a very divided society. It's still a percentage of Bolivians still have a racist mindset. They will love to undermine these constitutional reforms. They will love to change this constitution and go back to the past. So it's not over. Also, indigenous people's movements are now fractured. There is an increasing fragmentation of indigenous people's movements, which makes more difficult to implement these norms. So this is all wonderful from the legal perspective. However, I am afraid that from a political perspective, from the social and economic perspective, still indigenous peoples are systematically oppressed. Still, they are among the poorest in Bolivia, despite the progress made. Still, this is a struggle. And because this is a political struggle, a legal struggle, a struggle of war views, I believe international law is extremely important to continue to rely on the strength of the international community around the world and the recognition globally of indigenous people's rights as a main paradigm for all countries. The recognition of the fundamental norms of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is part now, I think, of the 21st historical context. And I think that we need to celebrate this, but at the same time, we need to be, very careful because even in Bolivia, I think there is so much more that needs to be done, and it's by no means things are resolved. Wonderful constitution, but I am afraid the implementation of those wonderful norms will take a very long time. Thank you.
Many thanks, Yuri. It may be, as you suggest, that the reform process in Bolivia has been imperfect, but it's clearly well ahead of our own record here in Australia on constitutional reform to recognise and to reflect Indigenous rights. But I suggest in the time available remaining to us that we turn to the discussion component of today's event. And Peter and Yuri are going to be joined by Manuela Fernandez de Cordova, the Charge d'Affaires of the Embassy of Ecuador here in Australia. And in that context, Manuela, let me put the first question to you. I think recalling the very first session we had in this series, that the right of Indigenous peoples to be consulted before adoption of legislation affecting their rights is also enshrined in the Ecuadorian constitution. Can you tell us how that works in practice? What triggers that consultation process? Who participates in consultations? And is there a formal requirement to take account of Indigenous views that are conveyed during that process? In 4 minutes or less. Thank you, Manuela.
Thank you very much. Now, just briefly to give a little bit of background, in the Constitution of 2008 in Ecuador, it includes the prior consultation and informed consultation. These are both included in the pre-legislative consultation and consultation on proposed projects. This means that when legislation related to Indigenous people is going to be formulated, the legislature must consult those people. In the event the government wants to promote a project that it is controlled within Indigenous peoples or involves the territory or identity of those peoples, it must also consult with them. This is expressly stated in our constitution. Unfortunately, as a little bit the presenter from Bolivia has mentioned, one thing is to have it in the constitution and another is to implement it. This is a bit more, it's very slow in Ecuador, but we have some advances in the last years. The biggest one will be just like in 2021, the executive created this Secretary for Development for Peoples and Nationalities. This exactly works like a ministry. It's in the ministerial level. And this institution or this ministry, this entity has the task to articulate the public policy together with the communities and the nationalities. And the executive has seen the secretary as one of the mechanisms to consult with the Indigenous people. And it acts as an articulating instrument. So by saying that, since 2008 until the present time, we haven't had any consultation that has come from the executive or any governmental body. But there has been other type of consultation that have arisen from the peoples, not only for Indigenous peoples, but from the community in general. The last example that we have was now the 20th of August. We had our presidential election and also a referendum regarding the Yasuni area. The Yasuni is considered the most biodiverse place in the world, and it's very rich in oil reserves. So the question arise to the population of Ecuador was, do we leave the oil underground so that all the biodiversity just remains untouched, or we exploit it? Also to mention that there are already a couple of companies in there already, but it wants the yes one. So what does this mean? That these companies need to leave slowly, and they need to establish again how it was before, this very pristine area that we have in Ecuador. But again, this is not only with this hasn't been just appeared from an Indigenous voice, let's say, but from the community in general. But it is very important because thanks to the Constitution in 2008, people have this cosmovision and it's enshrined in the Constitution. So it allows things like this to happen. So this is a big step for us.
Thanks very much, Manuela. Very interesting to note that the process of consultation has not been initiated in practice from the executive down, but rather from the ground roots up. because that is expressly provided for the process of consultation in the Constitution. Let me now pass the floor to Marcos Venteado, who's the president of the ANU Latin American Students Association, LASA, who I think has a question. Marcos.
Yeah, thanks, Noel, and thank you all for supporting the inclusion of this event in ANU's first ever Latin America Week. I have a question for you here. Polls generally suggest that generally young people are more supportive of the voice than elders. What are your reasons for this happening? What power does our vote have in states where the vote is expected to be close? And what advice do you have for young people like me who wish to advocate for my voice?
I think, generally speaking, the demographics have been that, and I think it's a fairly historical kind of demographic. If I remember back in the 80s when we were negotiating national land rights legislation with the then Hawke government, there was the same level of ignorance and racism that emerged in the discussions. And I think the analysis of the demographics clearly showed that the more younger white population was aligned to the view of the more older Aboriginal people's view about a kind of a coexistence and a reconciliatory approach towards relationships. And there was the other cross demographic was the older white people as opposed to younger Aboriginal people who were very much more fervent and angry about the kind of situation, more conservative in their views in terms of the kind of nature of their willingness to move towards a more kind of common ground. Sorry, the second part of your question was what you can do?
Second part, I think, was related to states where the voice was expected to be close.
The states. Well, in the 67 referendum, of course, was a majority of 90 plus nationally, which of course in the referendum you have to have a double majority, which of course is the majority of the general population has to support it, and then you have to have 4 of the 6 states who have to support it, so that you have to get that, and that was largely a matter negotiated, I think, during the Constitution conventions in 1897 as part of that additional security that the state governments sought to have and guarantee in terms of their rights against the kind of the authority of the Commonwealth government in the Federation. I think at the moment the polling seems to, and if you believe the polling, and I have my doubts about it in terms of not fully appreciating or understanding the methodology. There have been issues taken to task about the fact that they're using targeting the older demographic, white demographic, using home phones rather than mobiles and that sort of stuff. So getting the kind of opinion base coming from knowing what level or type of response they'll be getting. The Aboriginal polling is showing somewhat a little bit different. While they have it at I think the no vote moving up towards the late 50s, close to 60%, and then the kind of the yes vote is down, the kind of early 40s. But I'm told that that's not the sense of feeling, and I think that the support on the weekend with the marches would clearly indicate there's a lot more support than what's being said through polling that's being on the states. I think obviously Queensland and Western Australia historically have usually had a very hostile view towards Aboriginal reform issues. Western Australia in the 1967 referendum had the lowest count supporting with the states for supporting the 67 referendum. And of course, the New South Wales and Victoria are the strongest states. Victoria being the strongest. South Australia is kind of at a balance. There's and Tasmania looks like it will support it, but the reason for that, I suppose, is a lot of people have been saying we need more detail. I think it's personally the problem with the debate from the No campaigners. They've been very successful in clouding the issues fundamentally. this question about further details is referendums are run on principles. Referendums, no other referendum in Australia has ever been run on detail. Details are a matter for the Parliament after the referendum is made. The nature of the constitutional and kind of legal framework and authority for making laws is for the Parliament of the country. The Parliament, the principles are basically a representative voice to the federal Parliament to give advice to the government, to the executive, on matters relevant and pertinent to Aboriginal affairs only, as an advisory body. And the governments will decide how it is structured, what its level of mandate is and representation. So I think a lot of the debate has been clouded by it because when people ask for details are really about what the principles. They're the principles. An advisory body to give advice to government on matters pertaining and relevant to Aboriginal interest. The government continues to hold the legal authority to be able to decide what it wants to do in respect of the authority and the powers of it. So that's basically, and of course, as like any other piece of legislation, governments will debate that in the Parliament, and will decide its form and its structure. So, unfortunately, a lot of it is, I think there is an underlying element of racism. I think the whole nature of the kind of Trumpism politics has entered the environment. I like to say the Americans are, concerned about the kind of Russian interference in the presidential election. In Australia, we have foreign interference by the Murdoch press, largely in terms of this referendum. I think young people like yourself are very critical because I think what will happen is your demographic. Those of you under 30, 25 are probably going to decide the nature of what happens in the referendum. So I guess the theory of one person speaking to three people about its merits and its benefit is mathematically a way in which the referendum will get up. But it's about inquiring of people. There are many places to get information. We have at the ANU, we have our common concern documents, which outline 12 of the main common concerns that have been expressed in the public, and we respond to that in a very factual, direct way, and that's available from the portfolio. But there are multitude of different kinds of information from the ES23 campaign and other websites you can visit as well.
Thanks a lot, Peter. I wonder, Yuri, if I can direct a question to you. You touched on this briefly at the end of your presentation, but it would be good to drill down a little bit. And this is the question of implementation. How effective have the very progressive principles that you mentioned in the Bolivian Constitution been implemented in practice? And if there have been difficulties, what have been the main stumbling blocks? And even in the absence of full implementation, has there been some progress? I mean, would it be fair to say that the provisions of the Constitution, 2009 Constitution, have helped improve, even in a small way, the Indigenous people's way of life and vision for the future? And if so, how?
I would like to answer that question from an interdisciplinary perspective. I think we need to understand the implementation of the law in terms of political economy, and also we need to understand in terms of ethnic identity. So in that context, Indigenous peoples have been, for centuries, among the poorest in Bolivia. So the division of labor, the ethnic division of labor historically in Bolivia has placed Indigenous peoples in the lowest levels. So the constitutional reforms, the political reforms in Bolivia have been successful in empowering Indigenous communities, people from Indigenous origins, to have more access to economic strength, to economic power, as well as to political power. So that's a very positive component of this transformation of the Bolivian society, which includes the Bolivian Constitution. So you cannot deny that fact, that today Bolivia is a much more pluralistic country in which Indigenous peoples have more access to economic well-being. However, despite that obvious implementation of this new understanding of Bolivia as a pluralistic society, today, the middle upper classes of Hispanic descent are extremely upset. They cannot acknowledge that people from indigenous origins can be equal. So it's not only a matter of political power, but it's a matter of ethnic politics. For them, for many of them, it is an insult to have people from indigenous origins, such as the Vice President of Bolivia, David Choquehuanca, in power, or the former President Evo Morales, because for centuries, there were only Hispanics, the ones that ruled the world. And so as a result of that, in the year 2019, there was a coup d'etat, an effort to undermine all these transformations and trying to restore the colonial worldview in Bolivia. So this is an ethnic struggle, very dangerous. Anytime Bolivia can have against very deep violence, because Bolivia is a fragmented country. And so despite this wonderful constitution, you know, it's like, this is like a child, right? It's a new constitution that needs to develop, needs to be implemented. Still, there is an ethnic conflict in Bolivia. And today, unfortunately, what is happening in Bolivia is that indigenous movements are fractured. There is a fracture between the ones that support the current government of President Luis Arce Catacora and the other side that supports former President Evo Morales. So Evo Morales and the current president of Bolivia today, they are not good friends. They are fighting one against the other, mainly because both, I believe, they want to be candidates for the presidency in the next elections. So there's a fracture in the indigenous movement. So all these things, you know, are there, and the culture of racism and colonialism is very hard to change. And so I would say that a large number of Bolivian white elites still embrace a very racist view of reality. That's why I mentioned international law. Unlike the international community that today, the international community globally is recognizing the key importance of indigenous people's rights, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, other international agreements, cases around the world. So I think in the 21st historical context, it is, I think it is a paradox that Latin American elites still embrace racism, neocolonialism, that they deny the central place of indigenous peoples in the history of Latin America. It's not only in Bolivia, it's all over Latin America.
Thanks very much, Yuri, for that. I think it's really interesting, your comment that on the one hand, the Constitution and its principles have, in a sense, empowered indigenous people in an economic and political sense. But balanced against that is the persistence, as you said, of a sort of colonial, racist view of how things were and what certain elites hope it will be returned to in the future. I'm very conscious of time marching on, but I do want to squeeze in another question, because we have with us today Cesar Alvarez, who's an academic from the Charles Sturt University and also the founder of the Australia-Colombia dialogue. I think you had a question, Cesar.
Yes, I made a slight change. My question is for Pia. And the question is about the practicality and the connection of the voice with the closing the gap targets. How do you think that the voice would benefit Australia in the attainment of those important targets, should obviously the referendum enshrines the voice into the Constitution?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think a lot of people are asking that question as well. I think what it will do, it certainly is not a panacea for everything, nor the silver bullet that's going to solve all the problems. But what I do think it does is brings greater transparency and accountability in regards to the nature of the kind of policy and program initiatives of government that go towards closing the gap. I think it's a very convoluted federated system. Obviously, most of the investment that goes towards dealing with closing the gap is, of course, federal money. But most of the delivery mechanisms are in fact through state government instrumentalities and agencies. And so I've commented publicly before that and certainly from reference to the Productivity Commission reports, which also made recent comments about closing the gap, indicated that probably around about 30 cents to the dollar would actually hit on the ground in terms of real projects and outcomes for Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people. Hence, there's a significant amount of wastage, if you like, that is goes through the kind of public administration system of the various departments, be it health, be it corrective services, child welfare, so basically you're providing, facilitating the continuing codependency relationship, in my view, between governments and First Peoples. I worked for the government before, so I've seen this. My first role in government, I ran an office the size of Victoria and was responsible for the Child Welfare Act. And I give as an example the multitude of different public servants who are employed. This is not criticism of public servants, because I think it's more about systemic issues in the system. And people who, as a practical example, live in remote areas, who have subsidised housing in very hot, in the tropical kind of areas, subsidised electricity costs, dealing with air conditioning allowances. They have government motor car. They have so they've basically got access to those facilities. They're travelling usually every couple of weeks or once a month down to Perth or to Canberra or to Melbourne for courses as part of their professional development. They go, if they travel out into the community, into the bush, then obviously there is camping allowance. It all adds up. So you look at where the value of that dollar is. Aboriginal people have no say over that. So basically, I think that there will be a greater focus in terms of the value of the investment going. And I personally believe, after about, I've worked 30, 40 years in this field, that will bring greater accountability. But I think also the other important part of this is to understand the opportunities with the changed demographic in the ownership of the assets that Aboriginal people now have. We have post-native title and land rights. We have, as I indicated earlier, 60, 70% plus interest directly or indirectly in land assets. The nature of the emerging and new economies, particularly the decarbonised economy, looking at critical minerals and special mineral, they're all going to be on Aboriginal land, presumably. So, but what we don't have is a kind of fit-for-purpose ready environment from a policy position where Aboriginal people, rather than being recipients of benefits, can be equity participants in the ventures themselves. And so that part of it is, in my mantra, is owning our own risk. So transferring some of that risk back onto the Aboriginal community, which will require an investment in building better governance capability, because there are issues of post-colonial relationships that deal with the kind of disputation issues, internal disputation issues that you find in every community, not just Aboriginal community, every community. Being able to heal that, being able to build in and understanding how we can deal with the question of generational trauma, irrespective of other people's views about that. It's a living reality we have to deal with. So we have to, I think that it will give better exposure and advice to traditional methodologies about how to deal with health and other issues. I think that that's where the potential for the voice is to have a greater sense of influence and providing directions and more clear guidelines on policy and programs where Aboriginal people are owning that risk themselves. And I think that's where it's, I think that's what will help.
Thanks a lot, Peter. I'm again in the unenviable position of having to draw this session to a close. I know that there are other questions, and I know that some of our speakers are prepared for other questions, but the reality is our time is up, and I don't want this session to automatically close by technology. So let me just say it's a fairly impossible task to try and summarize, I think, all that we've heard today from our excellent panelists, but let me make an attempt. I, as you have seen, am an inveterate note taker, and I wrote down 5 words that for me were very important takeaways from the discussion, both online and here in this conference room. So just bear with me and let me mention 5 words. First, disadvantage. Indigenous people, both in Australia and in Latin America, Bolivia in particular, are significantly disadvantaged compared with non-Indigenous citizens on virtually all social and economic indicators. Second word, legacy. The shared legacy of colonialism that both Peter and Yuri mentioned, colonialism in Australia and in Latin America, is pretty negative. It was marked by confrontation, it was marked by disease, by dispossession, by displacement, by discrimination, and by cultural assimilation. Yet in both cases, Indigenous peoples played no part in the formation of the states. Third word, invisibility. Why do I say that? Unless Indigenous people have a voice in civil society and decision-making institutions, they risk being invisible. But the effectiveness of national institutions, national mechanisms to give them that voice have had a pretty mixed record. Here in Australia, Peter mentioned the efforts in the 70s and 80s, which failed. Yuri mentioned the ongoing efforts in Bolivia to make Indigenous mechanisms more effective. Now, it depends, obviously, amongst other things, on the clarity of the mandate given to the voice, on the adequacy of resources allocated to the voice, and on the political commitment of governments. Whether that's going to happen, as Peter says, is the next stage in the discussion. The fourth word I noted down was reform, and clearly it's only been in recent years that have been steps, very small steps, I should add, towards constitutional reform to reflect Indigenous representation, recognition, and protection of Indigenous rights. In Bolivia, as we've heard, they were enshrined in the 2009 Constitution. In Ecuador, in its 2008 Constitution. In Australia, it is still very much a work in progress. The fifth and final point that I noted down was message. In practice, the experience in Latin American countries, Bolivia is a standout example, is that including this fine-sounding language on Indigenous recognition and rights in a national constitution is not in and of itself a guarantee, but by any measure, it sends a powerful message to the Indigenous community, both nationally and globally, and it provides a solid foundation upon which to build for the benefit of all citizens in the future. So that's my 2 bobs worth, my 5 words, if you wish. Let me conclude and wrap up this session by thanking our panelists, Peter Yu, Yuri Mantilla, and Manuela Fernandez de Cordova, for providing the background and perspective of some rather different and distinctive experiences in achieving constitutional constitutional recognition for First Nations people in Australia, in Bolivia, and in Latin America more generally. Let me also thank our invaluable technical and administrative support staff from the College of Arts and Sciences. And let me express the hope that you, the participants, can join us again sometime after the referendum date, 14 October, to consider the outcome of Australia's referendum on an Indigenous voice and to look at next steps. My strong impression from the 4 panel discussions that we've had so far is that there are indeed lessons to be learned, both positive and negative, from Latin American countries, which have gone through precisely the same process. Lessons about the membership of such bodies, their mandate, their procedures, their resources. Whatever the outcome, there's going to be a lot to discuss, a lot to decide, and a lot to learn. So until then, many thanks to you all once again for participating today. Adios and gracias.
Yeah.